Recently, there was an archaeological discovery in Israel. An archaeologist discovered, digging in the Negev desert in Israel, what the Negev is between Jerusalem and Egypt. You think of Jerusalem and Egypt down here, that's in the Negev desert, a desert area. He came across a sarcophagus containing a mummy. And after he examined it, he called the curator of a prestigious natural history museum to come. He said, I've discovered a 3,000-year-old mummy of a man who died of heart failure, apparent heart failure. And the archaeologist was so excited as he talked about these things. The curator replied, well, bring him here and we'll check it out. So they brought the sarcophagus with the mummy to the curator of the museum. They did I guess you would say a delayed autopsy, 3,000 years. And he said to the archaeologist, I'm so shocked. He did die of apparent heart failure. How did you know? He said, well, when we dug him up, we found a gambling ticket in his hand that said 10,000 shekels on Goliath to win. 10,000 shekels on Goliath to win. We're all familiar with the story of David and Goliath, aren't we? Even the culture uses it as a metaphor. We use it as a metaphor in sports and business and even in politics. In sports, it's painful still to talk about. It happened on September 1st of 2007. A small university traveled to Ann Arbor, Michigan, named Appalachian State University, the Mountaineers, I think they are. They traveled to Michigan, and they embarrassed my team on their own field. They beat them. It was a David and Goliath story. A Division II team came to the home field of a Division I team, number 5 in the country, and embarrassed them. Kind of in good company, though, because just this year, Appalachian State traveled to College Station in Texas and beat Texas A&M. Back in 1980, the Soviet hockey team was considered to be the best team in the world, and they were. But a bunch of college kids, because remember the Soviet hockey team were men. They were in their 30s, and they were late 20s and early 30s. They were strong men. Our hockey team were a bunch of college kids. Our hockey team embarrassed the Soviets on home ice and up in Lake Placid and won the gold medal. That was another David and Goliath story in sports. In business, there was a man, his name is Reed Hastings. Back in 1997, he rented the movie Apollo 13 at his local Blockbuster video store. Ever use Blockbuster Video? Are there any more around? No. I think there's one left. I think it's in, if my memory serves me, I didn't look it up, if my memory serves me, there was one Blockbuster video store that was not a part of the corporation. They had their own standalone store. And so they still exist. But Blockbuster Video charged Reed Hastings $40 late fee. He was so furious, he decided to start his own company. He started a little company, a small little mom and pop shop called Netflix. I don't know if you've heard of it. Right? Matter of fact, Blockbuster Video had an opportunity to purchase Netflix, but they didn't think it would work. There's no standalone video stores anymore. Everybody streams nowadays. So, everybody I know either has a Netflix account or uses somebody else's Netflix account, right? Politics, David and Goliath stories occur. I have to be honest with you. Back in 2016, I thought there was no way Donald Trump would beat Hillary Clinton. Matter of fact, Lucy and I have a tradition. When we go vote, we'd normally go out to dinner to celebrate, this ability to vote, that kind of thing. And so we went out to dinner after we voted, and we ended up coming home. I didn't even turn on the TV. I didn't want to watch Hillary gloat and shock the world. They're still upset about it. But David and Goliath stories happen all the time in sports and in business and in politics. But my question for you this morning as we consider 1 Samuel 17 is, what's your giant? Because we all have giants. that we're battling right now. Who's your giant? What's your giant? If you have your Bible handy, turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter 17 and seek to answer this question. And I'm going to dive down into this text. We're going to kind of do a flyover, actually. We're going to kind of focus on the main verses to get the story. You're probably pretty familiar with the story. There's a few things that will jump off the page at us, and then we'll apply it to our lives. David faced down a giant and was victorious. I'm going to talk about the challenge. First, let's talk about the challenge. The armies were gathered in the valley of Elah. The valley of Elah in Israel, there's a river that runs through this. It's actually more like a creek or a wadi that runs through this valley. I've been in that valley. It's not very impressive, to be honest with you. There's a hill over there, there's a hill over there, and it's a little depression. This is where the armies of Israel met the armies of the Philistines. And I was trying to envision, David and Goliath confronting each other in this valley. Notice what happens as they're there. In verse 4, let's pick up, reading from the English Standard Version. It says, there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits in a span. He was over 9 feet tall. Now, lest you think that's not possible, you've heard of Shaquille O'Neal, right? He's 7'2". 𝗵𝗵𝘁 was 7'6". There's been recorded instances of people over 8 feet tall. It is a possibility that Goliath was this large individual. Matter of fact, there's the Anakim in the lands that talks about in the book of Judges and Joshua, and these different giants that were there. Over 9 feet tall. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The weight was, what's it say there? 5,000 shekels of bronze, or 125 pounds. That's what he wore. And a coat of mail was kind of like a metal protector over his vital organs, 125 pounds. And he had a bronze armor on his legs and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of the spear was like a weaver's beam, just a large beam on the spear. And the head was 600 shekels of iron. It was 15 pounds. It was like throwing a shot put. The Olympic shot put, 16 pounds. That's how much the spearhead on his spear weighed. Quite a description of a champion. He stood, picking up verse 8, and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourself and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail, you'll be our servants." In verse 10, and the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed. They had great fear. They were afraid. Verse 16 tells us that they did this for 40 days. 40 in Scripture is a number of trial or testing. Imagine 40 days. Down the hill comes Goliath with his armor bearer, standing there over 9 feet tall and defying you. Say, "Send out someone to fight me." That's the challenge. Let's talk about some circumstances, because David's not there at the front. His 3 older brothers are there, but David's not there. And David's father, Jesse, actually sends him to the front with supplies for his brothers. Apparently, in those days, they didn't have the mess cooks. They didn't have a mess or a kitchen police, KP, to feed the soldiers. The soldiers provided for themselves. So Jesse's father sends David to the front with food. His 3 older brothers were there. And there was great fear in the camp because of the Philistine. David heard about it. In verse 26, he says, this is what David says, What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach of Israel?" Now, King Saul had said he'd give him one of his daughters, and they would no longer have to pay taxes. That's quite a motivator, right? What shall be done? For who, now notice what he says, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God. See, David sees behind the circumstances. He's able to perceive the circumstances, but he sees behind it to what's really going on. That God is being blasphemed, that God is being defied. When the words of David were spoke to Saul, they repeated them before Saul, I should say, and he sent for him. Verse 33, and Saul said to David, you're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you're but a youth. And he's been a man of war since his youth. You can't go against this Philistine. He's over 9 feet tall. You're just a kid. You're a teenager. You're not able to do this. David had resolve. David had courage. His response is classic. Verse 34. Your servant used to keep the sheep for his father. I used to keep the sheep. And there came a lion and a bear and took a lamb from the flock. I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and stabbed him, killed him, struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. Verse 37, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. I love that connection. Paw of the lion, paw of the bear, hand of the Philistine. God is going to deliver us. And Saul said, hey, go with God. Vaya con Dios, go with God. Notice what happens. Saul wants to loan his weapons to David. Now, Saul's a grown man. David's a kid. Probably his armaments won't even fit. Pick it up in verse 38. Saul clothed David with his armor. He put on a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped on the sword over his armor. And he tried in vain to go. I wonder if he tripped. Because this armament's designed for Saul's body, not for David's body. David's a teenager. Then David said to Saul, I can't go with these, for I've not tested them. I haven't practiced with these implements. I don't know how it will go with these. I want to use things that I'm familiar with. Then he took his staff, and he chose 5 smooth stones, 5 stones from the brook. Now, some would say, David lacked faith. He should have just taken 1 stone. I submit to you, whether he took 5 stones or 100 stones, going with a bag of stones and a slingshot, right, with cloth garments or leather garments, with a staff against a guy who's 9'6", that's faith. Whether he's got 5 stones or 100. You see, not only was there Goliath, but the text of Scripture tells us Goliath had 4 brothers. Maybe he was thinking ahead. Who knows? But it took faith to go out against this giant with just a slingshot and a stone. He took 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in the shepherd's pouch. A sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Saul said, I'll give you the best of my armor, but David said, no, I'm going to go out with my slingshot. Wow. Now, let's look at the conversation, because Goliath and David are going to have a conversation about what's transpiring. In verse 41, as David's there in this valley, you just imagine, this valley with a river going through it, or a creek, and there's David and Goliath on opposite sides. Goliath says, verse 41, the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer, his armor bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him. He disrespected him. What are you doing? You send out this kid. He says, am I a dog? Do you think that low of me that you send out a little kid? I'm going to wipe the floor with this kid. And the Philistine looked and saw David. He disdained him, for he was youth, ruddy, he was dark in appearance. He's out in the sun all the time. Handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. David had something to say too. I marvel, this story is amazing. And beloved, it's a true story. It's a true story of what God can do with a person who has faith to believe that Jesus can meet his need and protect him and see him through. The story resonates in my heart that God is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all we can ask or think. Verse 45, then David said to the Philistines, and Joni read this text to us this morning. You come to me with sword and with spear and with javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. I come in the name of the Almighty. You come with sword and spear and javelin, but I come equipped with him who lives in eternity. The God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied, this day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. That's pretty strong language. I'm going to cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that the earth may know, listen, that the earth may know, that the earth may know that there's a God in Israel. And beloved, God wants to work in us and through us because there's people around you that need to know that there's a God in Israel, that there's a God here in America. Our culture needs to see real Christians, people who really believe the gospel, who really believe that God is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all they ask or think. That God is at work in our midst, that he's inside of us, and he's here to work. That the earth may know that there's a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's. Psalm 121, I think, goes something like this. I look to the hills from whence comes my help. I look to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. I don't know what your situation is. I don't know what giants you're facing today, but the God of heaven and earth is able to slay the giants at our feet. If we're willing to step out in faith and believe that God is able, not with sword and spear, for the battle's the Lord, he'll give you into my hand. Now the conflict. So the challenge, the circumstances, the checking of the equipment, the conversation, now the conflict. Verse 48, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, notice, David ran quickly. He was running towards the Philistine, reaching into his bag of stones and putting it in his sling and getting ready to pounce. He didn't kind of like hide behind a rock and, he ran towards the Philistine to meet him. He ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. Pow! That hurts. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell down, face down on the ground. So David prevailed, verse 50, over the Philistine with sling and with stone and struck the Philistine and killed him. It tells us he actually took off his head, held it up. Now, the average head of a male weighs about 15 to 18 pounds. A bowling ball, basically. Goliath was a giant. Had to weigh at least 50 pounds. Of course, the Philistines were then routed as the Israelis saw that the champion was dead. That God had been victorious through David because of his faith. They routed the Philistines. But my question for you this morning is, what are your giants? What are you facing today? What are you encountering? Who is it or what is it that you're encountering that's challenging you to think, God, please help me, meet me in the situation. I need 5 smooth stones in my bag. I need a sling. Think about this interaction between David and Goliath for a second. David saw Goliath. He could see him. He's 9 foot tall. He's standing there 40 days, pardon me, insulting God and the God of Israel and the Israelis. 40 days he could see Goliath with his armor bearer as he challenged the nation. Send out a champion. We'll determine this. He could see him. He could hear him as he blasphemed God. And no doubt, pardon me, he could smell him. I don't think personal hygiene was a big deal back then. They didn't have showers. You know, I just imagine all going on there, the armies, the banners in the sky, or the being flown, the different pennants. And here's Goliath and David. He's confronting the giant, and the giant's right there. What a scene that must have been that David had encountered. That David was not fearful. He didn't let his eyes dictate to him what he knew to be true. Who was this uncircumcised Philistine, he would say? He was a physical threat, no doubt. He was an imposing figure. But as I mentioned, David could look beyond the physical circumstances to what was really going on. There was a spiritual battle here as well. And a lot of our issues are physical, beloved, but there's a spiritual battle behind the physical that's going on. Pardon me. It's been said it's hard to perceive what's going on. It's been said some people make things happen. David is one of those individuals that makes things happen because of his faith. Some people make things happen. Others watch things happen. Then there are those who don't know what's happening. We don't have to be in that group, beloved. We don't have to be manipulated by the culture or manipulated by the media to think something's going on that really isn't going on. Because our culture is trying to get us to swallow hook, line, and sinker. Pardon me. God prepared David for that day. Think with me for a minute. Pardon me, a little scratch in the throat. God was preparing David for that day. What was his occupation before meeting Goliath? He was a shepherd, right? He was a shepherd. What are the working conditions of a shepherd? They're with the flock, out in the field, away from the village, away from home, all by themselves, hours, day in and day out. What did David do with his time when he was there watching the sheep? He wasn't playing video games. He wasn't surfing YouTube videos, right? He had a lot of time to occupy, so what did he do? He had a lyre with him, a harp, a guitar, if you will. And he was playing worship songs out in the field with the sheep. God was preparing David to be the sweet psalmist of Israel, all by himself with his lyre, worshiping the God who made heaven and earth. And by the way, where he was at that time, no light pollution from major cities. He could see all the stars. He could see the Milky Way galaxy, the Milky Way and the Milky Way galaxy. And he would worship God and say, the heavens declare the glory of God. The very firmament, the sky shows his handiwork. Day and day it utters speech. Night and night it shows knowledge. He would play that song on his harp as he was worshiping me, becoming the sweet psalmist of Israel. At least 73 psalms. How many psalms are there, by the way? Anybody know? 150, thank you. At least half of the psalms were written by King David. Also, not only did he have a lyre or a guitar, he had some stones and a sling, and I'm sure he was out there practicing. Getting bored, well, let's see if I can hit that tree over there. Boom. Let me see if I can hit that one over there. Boom. He spent his time getting prepared for worship and, dare I say, war, the battle that God had prepared him for. I don't know what God's preparing you for. He's got you in a situation, maybe you're wondering, what does it matter with my life? What can I do? I'm stuck in this dead-end job. Or we live in this community that I'm uncomfortable with. Or I go to this school that I don't really care for. You know, we all have these contexts in which we live, but God is using those very contexts, beloved, to prepare you for something greater. Imagine David, how bored he must have been out there in the field, day after day, night after night. Yet he occupied his time with things that matter. God prepared him. Have you ever heard of a gentleman named Walt Disney? Listen to what Walt Disney said. All the adversity I've had in my life, all the troubles and obstacles. I'm sure you have obstacles in your life. I'm sure you have trouble and adversity in your situations. All the trouble, all the obstacles, all the adversity, he says, have strengthened me. You may not realize it when it happens, but just maybe a kick in the teeth may be the best thing that's ever happened to you. Make a world of difference in your life. Those situations where something happens and you're thinking, oh, this is the worst day. This is the worst thing that could ever happen to me. But if this worst thing that could ever happen to you didn't happen, down the road, that best thing that does happen would have never happened. God used that worst thing to bring the best to you. There was an individual who wrote a book called David and Goliath, Malcolm Gladwell. He writes about the lives of many leaders and successful business individuals. And he calls it, in spite of the disadvantages that these leaders had experienced, they were tremendously successful, and he actually called it the advantage of disadvantage. The advantage of disadvantage. And one journalist was with a bunch of business leaders and asked them, how many of them had been diagnosed with a learning disability, a learning disorder? Half these successful business leaders raised their hand. Because you see, beloved, sometimes it's that person that tells you, I don't think you can do it, that gives you the motivation to do it. Sometimes when someone says to you, and you see this in sports, how many individuals in sports were told by their coaches, their parents, their friends, their colleagues, you won't make it. What made you make it? That person told me I couldn't do it. I wanted to prove to them I could do it. Sometimes an obstacle, a disadvantage, is the best thing that can ever happen to us. God can use those circumstances to prepare us for something great. I don't know what your Goliath is today, what your giant. We all have different giants. Maybe your giant is a diagnosis. And you're thinking, there's no way. What's God doing in my life? How can this be? God is able. I believe God is able to do exceedingly and abundantly beyond what we can ask or think. Maybe your diagnosis is, your giant is financial. Oh my gosh, I don't know how I'm going to make it. What's the matter? Pastor, I need $1,000. Oh my gosh, that's a huge number. Used to be a huge number, not anymore, right? With inflation going on. But oh my gosh, I need $1,000. What's going on in my life? How can God help me here? Now, let me back up a second. Some of us perceive problems as small problems and big problems, right? $10, small problem. $10,000, that's a huge problem. I don't know how God's going to intervene in that situation. From our perspective, yeah, there's a difference. But from God's perspective, help me here. He made everything. He made it out of nothing. He calls all the stars by name. And by the way, not just the Milky Way galaxy, but all the other galaxies as well. He's got them all in his head. He knows everything. He knows each one of us intimately. Aren't all problems with God small? I mean, they're huge to us. How are we going to overcome this? I don't know. But God is able. If we trust him, so whether it's a diagnosis or a financial situation, or maybe it's a termination. Oh my gosh, how am I going to find another job? What's going to happen here? How is God going to be glorified in this? God is able. Sometimes we need a kick in the teeth. As God prepares us from something that was not what he wanted for us to something that he does have for us. Can I brag about someone for a minute? It's not me. But can I brag about someone for a minute? There's a person in our congregation who, despite the circumstances, always looks up. Her name is Melody. She loves God. She's amazing. She had a cancer diagnosis, had radical surgery. The day after her surgery, I texted her, "How are you doing? I'm praying for you." This was her response. Oh, I've got to look it up here. Bear with me. I was blown away by her response. And whenever she responds to me, she makes me feel more encouraged than I think I could ever do for her. I texted her after her surgery, and it came back in block letters. This is the day after the radical surgery. "Thank you!" exclamation point. "This time has given me time for reflection. I'm now on the 6th book of the Bible, Joshua. I'm doing each book of the Bible, taking notes. The feeling, this is amazing. Learning, feeling great. Tomorrow my tubes come out, going to oncology to see if I need chemo. I continue to sit quietly, hearing God's reassurance." I read this with tears. "No anxiety, worries, or fear. And thank you for your prayers." I get these kind of things. She's just in the hospital again with another procedure. I text her, "How are you doing?" "The Lord is good. What a beautiful day. The sun is out." She's able to look past the circumstances, beloved, to a God who loves her and cares for her. What's your giant today? That giant stands no chance in the face of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Maybe your giant is doubt or fear. Our culture is seeking to manufacture fear to control people. Don't let the fear get a hold of you. I'm not saying being reckless. You know, when someone tells me they have the flu, I don't shake hands with them. I don't want the flu. Someone is coughing with a cold, hey, it's good to see you. Let's that hug. I don't want a cold. I like to share things, but I don't want to share that. Right? I'm not talking about being foolish or take inordinate risks, but hey, let's not be controlled by fear. I told you, when COVID first started, I went to Wegmans. I had a mask on, I'm in there, and there's a lady getting the cart, and I'm probably 12 feet from her. And as I walk, and I stop, and she looks at me, she goes, "Get back, get back." I say, "Hey, I'll get back. Looks okay. Whatever you need." But I want us to be done with being manipulated by fear and doubt. Because there's a God who lives in the heavens, and he loves us and cares for us, and he will see us through. No giant can stand in front of him. What's your giant this morning? Know this: there is a God in Israel, and God's using that circumstance in your life so that others may know that there's a God in you, Jesus Christ, who lives, who dwells, who's resurrected, who's able to do exceedingly abundantly above all we ask or think. In his name, we will triumph through Christ.